All right, well, we'll get started. My name's Joon Park.
I'm Mihai, nice to meet you.
We are engineering managers working on Backstage at Spotify, and we're here to talk to you about Backstage. So, we'll dive right in. What on earth is Backstage anyway? Well, we have a website, it's backstage.io. You go to it and you see this phrase, an open platform for building developer portals. So I have friends who are developers. They obviously know that I work on a developer-facing product, so they ask me, oh, Joon, what do you work on? What's your product? Tell us about your product. And I send them to this website, and they read this phrase, and they're like, what does this mean? I read this, they tell me, I read this sentence, but I don't really understand what it means. And, my friends, they're, pretty intelligent people. Most of my friends, they're pretty intelligent people. I like to think they know what they're doing. And if they read this and they can't really figure out what Backstage is from this, then, yeah, it's not just you, right? So there's more to dive into here. So let's go into it. Let's talk about these two words first. Developer portal. What the heck is a developer portal? I think if you say this phrase, a lot of people might have different conceptions on what that actually might mean. The developer portal, as we like to describe it, is a solution to this problem. By a show of hands, who relates to this on a very deep and emotional level? Yes, yeah, I think a lot of us here, and you probably know many colleagues who also have tabs like this. It's very true. The complexity that engineers face on a day-to-day basis has exploded, especially recently. And as businesses grow, they need to bring on more technology. There's more features to build, more customers, higher scale. It's a vicious cycle, right? And you got to add to that new languages that come in once in a while to your workload. You have new frameworks, open source tooling, SaaS solutions. There's, anything you could think of, right? It involves working, and it becomes more of a load on your day-to-day, and your computer starts to look like this, right? So this fragmentation is what's slowing engineers down. Having to navigate through all the different tools that your organization uses, having to know how to get the information that you need. That's the thing that's slowing people down. And so that is the problem the developer portals are trying to solve. A single pane of glass where an engineer can access all the information that they need and perform all the tasks they need to perform. So a developer portal aims to turn an engineer's desktop from this to this, right? Just your code, a developer portal, that's it. Everything that an engineer needs to do in their day-to-day that is not writing actual code, they should be able to do in a developer portal like Backstage. That's the idea. So let's go back to this sentence, now that we've covered what a developer portal is. What does the rest of the sentence mean? Well, open means open source. So you can go find Backstage on GitHub, look it up for yourself. We provide Backstage free of charge. It's a platform, so meaning the intent of Backstage is to allow you to build the right developer portal for your company, right? Given this, hopefully this sentence, an open platform for building developer portals, is starting to make a little bit more sense. Just a show of hands, who's heard of Backstage before today? Oh, wow, almost everyone. That is amazing. Great. And if anybody is using it at their company in production by any chance? Yeah, a few hands. Awesome. That's great. So let's dive into Backstage itself a little bit more. You might ask, how does Backstage actually help engineers? There's three core areas that we like to talk about when we're talking about the problem space that Backstage tries to solve. So the first is speed. We talked about this already in terms of fragmentation. That's the thing that's slowing us all down. By greatly decreasing fragmentation, Backstage is able to boost developer productivity in your organization. Developer portals like Backstage are going to help you increase the speed at which engineers work by providing them tools to work autonomously and get the information they need at the click of a button. The second is standards. As the number of tools and repositories grow, it's so easy for organizations to quickly lose all sense of cohesion. Backstage can help you roll out standards through your organization by making it easy for engineers to adhere to standards, right? It's this concept of making the right thing the easy thing to do. And finally, in order for a developer portal to be successful, it needs to have a good ecosystem. What do we mean by that? Well, Backstage at its core is very simple, but allows customization through plugins. And you'll hear a lot more about these plugins and kind of what value they provide in a bit. But the idea is that these plugins can be built inside your own organization to suit the needs that your company, your engineers might have that are specific to you. In a successful Backstage instance, this ecosystem really becomes a living thing. And as your development needs change, as your company needs change, your ecosystem can also and should also evolve with time. And that's the idea. Backstage kind of naturally enables that through this developer portal concept, right? In a second here, Mihai will actually take you through some of the user journeys within the Backstage UI that help us get a better sense of how these three core needs are addressed. But first, we're going to talk some numbers. Just some quick stats to give you surrounding our open source repo, just to get a sense of how popular Backstage actually has become. Here's some numbers up there. And in terms of the viewpoint from the company perspective, here are some organizational numbers. And keep in mind, because of the open source nature of Backstage, these are just the companies that we know about. So it's likely that there's probably a lot more than this out there that we don't necessarily know about. So given all this, we think that this is the current approximate number of developers impacted by Backstage. Obviously, we're hoping to grow this a lot more. But already, this is quite large. As you can see, we've got a pretty fantastic open source community surrounding Backstage, and there's a ton of contributions coming in all the time. There's well over 100 plugins out there, and that's just the ones we know about. These plugins have, help you integrate the most popular third-party services and tools into your Backstage instance, like Jenkins, GitHub, PagerDuty, you name it, right? If you can think of it, probably there's a community plugin out there for it, which is really great. And if you're interested in a more expertly curated set of plugins, I'll be talking a little bit more about the Spotify plugins for Backstage bundle later on in the talk. So I will hand it over here to Mihai.
Thank you, Joon. What better way to continue than walking you through some of the main cases for which we actually use Backstage at Spotify. Now, before we dive in, I did want to make a quick disclaimer. In order for all of you to get home safe and at the reasonable time tonight, I took the liberty to pre-record the demos, because what usually happens is that when engineers attempt to do live demos, things go reasonably well. When engineers managers like me try to attempt live demos, not so much. Some credentials are missing, some token is expired, some security flag that I shouldn't be even having access to because of security reasons. So because of that, nevertheless, I've got the setup, I've got the local machine down there somewhere. So in the QA section or afterwards, please raise a hand there if you want to talk. I wanted to talk to you all tonight about three main things. One, the centralization of technology assets. As a business or organization grows, so does the number of services that power up the product underneath. Like the classic example here, we have a monolith that we've broken into microservices, and now suddenly we need to worry about how those microservices communicate, who they belong to, what's the ownership model, and so on. This all can become over time a pain. To address that, meet Catalog. Software Catalog is responsible for centralizing an entire organization's technology asset. It provides a way to index all of the data and all the metadata that lives alongside with, so that an individual or a group can easily manage those services and its state. So it's safe to say that at this point, Backstage can make it easy, for example, for a team or a squad to manage their, let's say 10 services, but it can also make it possible for an entire organization to manage their thousands of services. Now, in a second, I'll play the, where do I, here? In a second, I will play a video. But before if only I can pause this. Perfect. But before I do, I just wanted to make a quick disclaimer here. What you're seeing here is a oversimplified version of Backstage, the one that we have at Spotify, which is 8 years old. So not a baby, not a toddler, somewhere around elementary school. So you can imagine it's a little bit more complex than that with its own challenges. So this is an oversimplified version of it. But at the end of the day, the principle stays the same, right? It talks about the indexing principle of how do we manage the assets into one place. So let's see what we're talking about. This is the main page where one can see all the, oh my God, that's going to be perfect. Let me stop there. So this is the main page where one can see most of the entities that live in the catalog. Now, before we dive into that, I just wanted to make a quick observation that the way we model the software in catalog follows three core entities, sorry. Number one, components. Those are the individual pieces of software. Let that be a backend, let that be a front end. Number two, the APIs, which is the way components talk to each other. And number three are resources, which is the physical or virtual infrastructure that lies underneath. Let that be an S3 bucket or an SQL. Now, out of all these three things, the API is the first-class citizen. And why is that? Is because it is important, APIs are exposed by the components, and they have to be defined in a machine-readable state so that we can build the automation tooling on top to create that analysis and this self-discoverability ecosystem on top. So in this case, that's depicted in the image. We browsed and we want to learn more about an API. We found an API here. We've got a couple of things around a visualization of how the relationships are built, who's consuming that API. Also, its definition of it. This is a good old Swagger definition of what the API is actually doing, alongside with its documentation, which is pulled from the code directly into this Backstage so that one can easily browse. But I'll get to that in a second. Going back to the catalog, this is the main. Let me see if I can pause. Hey, there you go. This is the main view, as I mentioned. As you see, we've got a couple of websites here, some documentation pieces. Some of these things are, the life cycles is production. For some of it, it's experimental. So basically, this is my place where I can pretty much filter and look for my data. If I select one of the components, let's assume we have a React app, a website there, like a lunch app. This is, again, my interface where I can browse more around it. Again, see the relationships, who's consuming that. And at the top, I wanted to flag that, to Joon's points, all of the things that you see at the top there, the CI/CD, the code insights, the API, those are all plugins. So in this case, this is a depiction of what we have in one of the demo instances, but all of those plugins can be, this is super flexible and configurable. So the UI and the underlying plugins there can fit whatever your organization needs. So all of those integrations can be something that whatever your ecosystem needs to feed in there. In our case here, we've got for example, a CI/CD where we're plugging all of the data from GitHub. Maybe we want to see what was the last commit, what are the builds there, what was the last logs, the latest logs that we had there. And a couple of other code insights. Maybe we want to have something about how much this component actually costs in the cloud. What are the official documentation, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. So that is catalog. If only I can. Wonderful. Number two. Joon mentioned earlier that fragmentation is one thing that is slowing developers down. Well, over time at Spotify, we noticed that another thing that is slowing down developers is the actual process of software creation. That is because, for example, I'm a developer and I want to implement a new playlist management system. I need to implement a new backend. Instead of me focusing on the actual problem that I am trying to solve, my immediate reaction is I need to worry about how is monitoring going to look like, how is tracing, what the logging will look like. So instead of focusing on my problem, I need to think about all this boilerplate code that is pretty much slowing me down in my approach of writing the code. So in order to address that, meet Scaffolder, or what we call the software templates, whose purpose is to create repeatable templates for the engineers so that you give them something as simple as a UI where they're like going to define in a short UI, okay, I want this repository, I want this name, and I want to own this project. That's it. And then you let the automation do all the heavy lifting underneath to kind of like bring that project up to life. And let's see how that's going to look like. I'm back again in catalog. This time around, we're going to the create page, if I can stop that for a sec. What you see here are all templates. And this is just a mere subset of what we have there in the open source. And a lot of them have been contributed by the community. So this is a handful of cookie cutters from integrations with Git or GitLab or whatever other solution. A lot of them are here. You can think of this as could be a Java backend, could be a Python library, could be pretty much anything that you can think of. Like in the words of William Shakespeare, the world is your oyster. You can define here anything that your organization has in the ecosystem. So let's see how that would look like. In our particular case here, maybe I want to create a new React template. I'm just going to write a few things there. This is my application. I'm just putting a couple of definitions right there, maybe a description so that this is easier later to be found. I select where do I want that to be chosen, to be placed in GitHub. I'm selecting an owner, and I let the automation do the magic. So what this does is that it's going to pull up all of these definitions that the user has introduced, alongside with all of that skeleton automation under the hood. Scaffolder is going to do all of that, and hopefully, I mean, it would be ridiculous in a pre-recorded for this to break, so hopefully this is working. If everything worked well, there we go. We now have a fully all this boilerplate code already created on GitHub with all of that bare bone best practices that you have in your organization. On top of that, alongside with creating the code, we're already registering this component into catalog so that it can easily be found later on. So that we already see what the model is, what the relationships are, and then depending on the plugins that you have at the top there, again, that you define in your organization, you can just start configuring that easily. And then there we go. In the last line, our our project has just been created. Number 3, last but not least, onboarding. Onboarding is hard. Whether we talk about hypergrowth, people coming in, people coming out, people changing teams, which is something that we actually have deeply ingrained in our culture at Spotify. Handling onboarding is hard. And I know what you're all thinking. Well, documentation is key for onboarding. Yes. But what is our biggest problem with documentation in our industry? Can anyone venture a guess? Sorry? Never updated. So everybody likes to read documentation. Almost nobody likes to write it. Inaccuracy, exactly. So, and if it is documentation, like you said, it's either inaccurate or it's defined in some centralized location somewhere in a knowledge base where, it's pretty hard to stay up to date to the point that you just mentioned. To address this, meet TechDocs, which is Backstage, which is the documentation plugin in Backstage, which allows writing technical documentation alongside the code. So you let the developers write a code, write the markdown documentation right there along the code commits and the pull requests and whatnot, and let the automation do all the heavy lifting of converting all of that markdown into a beautiful HTML that's browsable, indexable, and searchable later on directly into catalog, into a model. Now, at Spotify, we don't use documentation just to define services in software. We also use it to define what we call a golden path, which is more or less a getting started guide to get up to speed with a particular track. Say I'm new to my team and I want to learn how, what does the ecosystem look at Spotify for web development? And then I follow the golden path that sets me from the very beginning all the way to the end on how does the whole ecosystem look like and what do I need to learn in order to become efficient and effective, right? From security compliance to actually implementing the backend. Let me try to play the last video here, just to see a definition of what similar here. So we find the documentation piece in the catalog, and this is a golden path for backend engineering. And then we've got all of those steps listed out that I'm supposedly following when I want to transition myself into this vertical. And then if I find an error, for example, I have a direct option to go directly into the code, make that update, commit this code, and sort of like let the tech docs consume all of that documentation into the main hub. Let me move on.
All right, so I mentioned before a few more plugins that we'll talk about on top of the core set that Mihai just showed us. So we have something called Spotify plugins for Backstage. This is an expertly curated set of bundles that we are selling to companies who have adopted Backstage. We think that this is a really good combination of plugins that build upon this idea of developer effectiveness is a function of productivity and happiness. So we've curated some plugins that really think up-level both your developers' productivity as well as happiness. For the sake of time, I won't go into all of them. There's actually 5. There's 2 logos that are not shown here, but if you're more interested in those, definitely please feel free to come chat with us afterwards, and happy to talk more about them.
In conclusion, what we are experiencing right now is going far beyond, one second, I think the slide's broken here, perfect. What we're experiencing right now is going far beyond making developers happy. To be really fair, since we open source Backstage in 2020, the amount of learnings that we've had along with our adopters has been tremendous. And whether the adopters were small companies or large corporations, we've learned a lot on how many ways Backstage can actually add value for developers. So if it's anything that I want to leave you all with is please join us and let's shape together the future of developer experience. Thank you.